In this third talk, I want to talk about exchange and markets. In the first two, I talked about the 18th century framework of how you produce wealth, and the second, 19th century framework of how you distribute wealth. And in this, I'm going to talk about the 20th century framework of how you exchange wealth. So, let's look at exchange, and it's a good idea to start with Adam Smith, who thought that the idea of exchanging was really very deeply rooted in human societies. In the famous opening passage to The Wealth of Nations, he says, human beings have a certain propensity, or there is a certain propensity in human nature, the propensity to truck, barter and exchange one thing for another, which is common to all men and is to be found in no other race of animals. In other words, there is an innate commercial mentality among human beings, which are based on psychological absolutes, the desire to outdo others, something to do with games and competition, something to do with making marginal advantages over other people. Robbins's famous definition of economics fits within this, which is that economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources between alternative ends. People are competing, or they're competing within their own minds between things for scarce resources. Looking at this in an evolutionary kind of perspective, as I have done before, I'll give a brief outline of the famous theories of anthropology in the field of exchange. And I want to start first with gift societies, as you might call them, and reciprocity, which means giving backwards and forwards. The essence of the gift societies, as opposed to commodity societies, is that gift societies have multiplex social relationships. That means that you don't have a single relationship with someone, but a whole set of different relationships to the same person, whereas we tend to live in a single-stranded society, or one with lots of single strands, so that when you get onto the bus and just pay the bus conductor, that's all there is to it, whereas in most societies the bus conductor would also be maybe a friend, a co-villager, a relative, and so on. So in gift societies where the relationships are multiplex, the objects exchanged carry a whole weight of disparate meanings of a symbolic kind, and are channels for social relationships. It's not just a matter of giving some money. You're giving all sorts of things, all sorts of signals, so to speak, to the person you're exchanging with. While in our society, you can just give the money, and it's single-level relationship, largely of a functional kind. I want to get in on the bus, and that's it. It carries little other weight. Putting it another way, in the gift societies, and in most human societies, relationships are total. Every relationship is embedded in other relationships, and they are at many levels. In such an undivided situation, how does one transact? Well, using the famous distinction made by Marshall Salins between three types of reciprocity, as he calls them. One is negative, which is as in war. We'll leave on one side. There are two other main kinds. One is immediate return, or immediate reciprocities. In our world we use money, a pure form of direct and balanced exchange. I give you £5, you give me something directly in exchange, a book or food or whatever it is. The relationship is balanced, immediate and soon ended. This kind of thing is not appropriate in multi-stranded situations. We can see this, in fact, in our own society in relation to our family. If we pay for things within the sphere of the family or our friends, then people are deeply offended. If I pull out my credit card after my wife has cooked a meal, or a friend has helped me mow the grass, it would be insulting. Friendship is much more, and family is more complex, it's multi-level. Yet we do need to bind people together to exchange with them. And So here we have what are called gift societies. In the gift, we cast our bread up on the waters. There's a delay. You don't exchange immediately, hoping perhaps that it will come back to us one day, but with no guarantee of that. We freely, without obligation, give something to someone which we consider to be valuable and hope they will as well. We ask for no immediate return, or even a specific return. Yet the gift, in fact, is not free. There is no such thing as a free lunch. The gift always has implications. The formal features of the gift are described by Solins under what he calls delayed or generalized reciprocity. It's generalized because it goes round in a sort of circle, as in the famous Kula institution of the Trobriand Islands, where the valuables go from A to B to C to D and then back to A, so it goes in a general circle. And it can be reciprocated, but after a delay, not straight away. It should be allowed to linger and be paid back by something equivalent, or maybe with some interest as time has passed. But you're not paying back directly, but giving another gift back again. It should be reciprocated because, as Marcel Mauss, who famously described the gift is not just the physical thing that you give someone, the animal, the plant, or whatever, but also an inner essence or spirit. Drawing on the famous Polynesian concept of the hau, that's H-A-U, or spirit of the gift, Mauss showed how when we give a gift it has two parts, the physical shell and the inner spirit. So when a person receives a gift, they receive the physical thing, whatever it is, a necklace for example, but they also receive the, so to speak, almost magical spirit within it, a substance which is left hanging in the air. The famous example, as I mentioned, is Mauss's analysis of the Maori hau, and here's one description of it by Christopher Hann. Mauss argued, following, so he thought, the local model, that to give something was to give a part of oneself. The spirit of the gift was a link between the object given and the donor. When you give something, you give away yourself, a bit of yourself. Mauss emphasized the sense of obligation involved in all gift transactions. There was an obligation to give, but there was also an obligation to receive and to repay. And from these various obligations, a kind of social order emerged. This is what held people together, this backwards and forwards giving and taking. The total prestation is another word for gift, is quite distinct from an act of voluntary generosity. It's not just you're being nice to someone, it is part of your social relationship. It's not voluntary, you have to do it in order to survive in these societies. So, this idea of delayed, multi-level exchanges can be seen in all spheres of life in non-money economies. But it's not disappeared on our own. One example is in relation to religion. The central idea of sacrifice in religion is that it is a communicative exchange, not between humans, but between humans and spirits. Where I work in the Himalayas, for example, when you want something done by the gods, you want your child to get well or whatever, you give them a gift. You kill a cockerel, for example, and you give them the blood. And then the gods, or the godlings, are hopefully pleased by this, and they make your child well. So what the gods get is the spirit of the cockerel. You may yourself eat it, and your family may eat it, but they get the spirit of that cockerel and the blood, and that makes them happy, and this ensures good things happen to your family. You cannot force godlings and gods to do things, but you can put pressure on them by giving them gifts. And a central feature of these sacrifices, and of many gifts, is destruction, the annihilation, the physical annihilation of the gift. You sacrifice the animal. You have given away something, you have lost it, you have destroyed something. And you can see this in a famous example in competitive gift giving of the North Coast American Indians, such as the Kwakiako. There, famously, status competitions between rich kin groups takes the form of destroying precious assets, jars of oil, precious woven objects, etc., are all thrown onto a fire. They're actually destroyed. As each object is destroyed, those on the other side lose status and are challenged to destroy an even greater amount until you've finished. The obvious modern analogy is the huge, wasteful competition of the international arms race, particularly during the period of mad, mutually assured destruction of the Cold War. But even today, there are many forms where we just conspicuously destroy things and then get status from them. A lot of gambling is almost like that. Another element of the gift and its long-term nature is as a way of banking or storing valuable things. I talked earlier about the difficulties of creating some kind of superiority in simpler societies, and the best way to do that is not to accumulate wealth yourself, but to give it away and bank it in other people. If a person gains a surplus at a point in time, there's no way in many societies where you can actually store it in a bank vault, so to speak, or building society, or speculate on the stock exchange. But you may need to save it up for a rainy day, for a wedding or for a feast or something. So you give it away to people who are then under obligation later to give it back to you. So the best way to store wealth is actually to have a big feast, a huge wedding, shower people with presents, endow a university in our society or whatever, and merit will come back to you later. As the Bible says, lay not up for yourselves treasure upon earth where moth and rust do corrupt and thieves break in and steal. But give it away, bank it in other people. And then, of course, this is, in many respects, the quintessence of much family life in most societies, even in our society. Parents give love, shelter, food, clothing, and so on to their children over their first 20 years in the hope, maybe, that they will get some respect and maybe a little affection and maybe even some help later on in their lives. In our society, as the philosopher John Locke put it, the honour due from a child places in the parents a perpetual right to respect, reverence, support and compliance to, more or less, as the father's fair cost and kindness in his education has been more or less. In other words, what you invest in your children, you may expect back in some kind of reverence and support later on. But of course it seldom works that children directly pay this back. It's a form of generalized exchange. You give to your children, they give to their children, and they go out and work in the economy, and their taxes go back into the system, and then when you're old, your pension will be derived from the wealth they are generating. You cannot force or bribe them by giving them wealth to love you or to do anything for you in your old age. That was the big mistake that King Lear made, of course, believing that by giving away his kingdom to his children he could force them to look after him and force Cordelia to love him. There is no right created by this. It's just an obligation of some kind, and it cannot be forced. Those are the very simplest mechanisms of gift giving, and they overlap very quickly with another form, which are barter and a form of market economy. It's reported that even in the simplest hunting and gathering societies, which mainly live by gift exchanges, there is usually some barter. That's not barter in the sense of haggling over something, but giving someone something in the hope that they will directly exchange it with something else. For instance, a forest hunter and gatherer may bring down some honey or fruit or animals and put it on the side of the road or on the side of a village, go away and then hope that they will come back and the next day find something useful that they want. And of course, if they don't after a few attempts, they'll give up. The exchanges may not even meet, but there is a kind of bartering going on. A little more developed are very specific peripheral markets. These often developed alongside other things. For instance, there may be a religious festival going on, as happened in the Himalayas where I work, and then a few market traders will come along and make use of that and bring a few goods, and people will exchange them or buy them. The main characteristic of these markets is that they lie on the edge of pleasant life and other tribal life, and deal with peripheral things, not basic foodstuffs, but they may be extremely useful things which you cannot produce within the village, like baskets or pots or salt or maybe long-distance traded items. The central economy here is not marketized, but often what starts as an infrequent and marginal event, for instance at a river crossing, as at the bridge over the River Cam, or the ford at the River Oxon Ford and Oxford and Cambridge. At these places, a town builds up through this marketing mechanism, and you get instituted markets growing. Towns become markets. Nevertheless, most production is directly for consumption in these societies, and only surpluses and certain extras are marketed. It's not a market society, as one may term it later, but a society with markets. And these market systems are often very complex. One pattern of them, as in China, famously described by Bill Skinner, is that you have a huge market in a big city, and then round it a kind of constellation of smaller markets, around each of which you have smaller markets. And as you move out and out into the smaller and smaller markets, the objects which are brought to market become more and more peripheral and small scale. In many ways, the closest we get to the kinds of peripheral markets which anthropologists have described for most peasant societies is, in our society, I think, is the world of car boot sales, if you're familiar with that, which is an very widespread English phenomenon, which I've only seen in passing, but it looks on the surface like this. People fill up the boot of their cars with objects which they don't want themselves, and then they drive to a designated site where other people are there, and then they go to someone else's car boot and they buy something, and people come to their car boot and buy things from them, and they set them out and they exchange things, and it happens at weekends, and it's peripheral to their main occupations often, though there are a few people who do it all the time. So it's a kind of peripheral market, but on a large scale. People are constantly exchanging items, filling their garages with things and then trading them on, going for a day here and there. Somewhat different is a marketing solution which was very widespread in peasant societies, and that is the fair. Cambridge, where I teach, is an excellent place to talk of fairs, as it is an ancient centre of what used to be at one time one of the greatest fairs in Western Europe, Stourbridge Fair. This was held every year for several months, a couple of months every year, on the meadows off the Newmarket Road in Cambridge. Goods were brought from all over Britain, including Scotland and Ireland, and even many parts of Western Europe and Russia. Cheeses, animals, cloths, spices, metal goods, all sorts of things were brought to this hub. They were brought here because it had good water communications. You could bring them along the rivers, ending up with the Cam, and then set them out in your stalls. They were set out in stalls which formed whole sub-areas, and indeed if you travel up that road now, you still find roads called Cheddar, Row and Garlic Lane, and these are the relics of the great fairs which petered out in the 18th, 19th centuries as the railways developed. And Daniel Defoe describes them at great length in his journal of his travels tour around England. They were so important that there was a special hospital built there for people who were ill, which still survives, and you can see it just beside the railway bridge on the Newmarket Road, and there was a special judicial court that was held. And this was part of a great fair-based civilization with famous fairs in Germany, France and elsewhere. It was really only killed off in the 19th century with the rise of railways and shops. This is one of the ironies, in a way, is that what happens is that as market society in the modern sense rises, these kinds of fairs and markets decline. Because for a while markets and fairs are on the periphery. They are peripheral markets. But societies where the market principle and the deeper sense has not yet fully taken hold. And this is pointed out by anthropologists who point out the apparent paradox that the rise of a capitalist market principle often spells the decline of traditional forms of peasant marketplace. Travelling around remotish areas of Western China in the early 21st century, we were able to film just the last marketplaces and market streets which were being pulled down very rapidly in the cities, centres of cities, to be replaced with supermarkets and shops. So you just saw the end of that world. The next great system, the one which we ourselves are familiar with mostly, is what one might call a market economy. A market economy is not to be confused with the physical market. That is to say, as in a marketplace in a city or town like the Cambridge market in the middle of Cambridge. It's instead a mentality, a morality, a way of thinking about things, a type of integration in which the great transformation to our modern world has fully, more or less, occurred. People basically orient their lives now to exchanging things, their labour, their skills, their personalities as a primary obligation. They can dispose of themselves and their ideas and everything around them more or less as they feel fit. They work for money first, which is then exchanged into what they want. Almost everything is translatable and purchasable. So when they have been paid in cash rather than in kind, they use that money to obtain what they need. The great change is in Marx's famous notation from commodities to money to commodities. In other words, you produce commodities which you sell and then you get other commodities, CMC as he called it, to MCM. We have money, you buy commodities, and then there's money. In the pre-market society, market world, the market is a neutral zone in which economic activities can take place. It's rather like a bounded playground or playing field or a football pitch of some kind in which other rules apply. Here, almost purely economic exchanges, unclouded by other aspects of life, can, in theory, take place. The physical market abides by market rules. For instance, if you're sitting in a market and you're selling something and your local priest turns up, or shaman, or your landlord, or you're a kinsman, in theory they have to pay the market price. They should be treated like anyone else in the market, although of course you may give them some preferential treatment. But they realize that this is not as it would be just in a face-to-face encounter in other circumstances. Shops and stalls might have their special customers. For example, members of a family may patronize a certain shop. In Nepal, where I work, the villagers came down and settled along certain roads leading into the local market town of Pokhara. And so the shopkeepers on particular roads have particular clientele who are their fellow villagers and kinsmen who come to their shop, and it would be considered disloyal if you went to another shop. But prices are prices, and so although you are loyal to a particular shop, you won't expect much discount on account of that. Trying to set up a neutral zone like this in a village where people abide by market rules is very difficult. My wife and I tried to set up a cooperative store in our Himalayan village, and after a very short time it collapsed because people couldn't really separate off their kin and family and neighbourly relations. So when they went to the shop they asked for credit and they asked for cheap goods and so on, because the person sitting in the shop was also a fellow villager. So they couldn't really get their heads around it, I think because we were funding it from outside, because there are village shops which work reasonably well on a small-scale way. So the market here is an insulated area in many societies, free from the normal embeddedness of life. But in the modern market economy, almost all of life is conceived of in this way. In other words, it's all part of a market. And it's underpinned by the huge paraphernalia of the state. Sometimes some people argue that modern capitalist economies can do without the state, but of course they couldn't last for a second without a very powerful state underpinning them and a legal system. So it's possible to be a free individual transacting, but that freedom, as in all games, is only possible because of the rules and because of the umpires and the context. The difficulty of transacting in a free and easy way in embedded societies is shown by the history of the Jewish ghetto. Because of the embeddedness of Catholic morality, the banking and marketing systems were greatly hampered. So lending at interest, for example, which was called usury, was technically forbidden. So the Jews, who had an ethical system which allowed them to lend money at interest, carried out such activities. But this was something which had to be insulated and isolated off from the rest of the society. So in Venice, where the first ghetto, which comes from the work for an armaments factory, was set up on an area which later became on an island, which was walled in and shut up at night. And the Jews all lived within this ghetto. They could go out and lend money to the Venetian traders, but they were shut off from the rest of the society. And periodically, when the political situation got to that state, they were rounded up and all the debts were cancelled, and they were often exterminated or driven away. Finally, what about the peculiar case of China? Here you have a nominally communist system with state control, some pressures against individualistic solutions, yet the most rip-roaring capitalist system in the world. This is achieved by rigidly separating the political from the other parts of life, and allowing the economy to be active and separate from the political system. A similar sleight of hand was practiced in Islamic societies, in the great souks or bazaars of the Middle East and India. For instance, in the great bazaar in Istanbul, you could trade in a way which separated you off from many of the religious and political constraints. The Arabs were great traders throughout the Indian Ocean area, and their founder, the Prophet Muhammad, was himself a tradesman, and he set them up with a system which made trading ethically acceptable and made them into great trading empires. Finally, there is the question of how the change from gifts to barter to limited money to full money have occurred. No one really knows how these great transformations occurred or why they occurred. Even the biggest transformation in many ways, that is from the pre-capitalist system of embedded markets within peasant societies to free market societies, is disputed. The anthropologist Polanyi thought it happened roughly between 1750 and 1850, what he calls the Great Transformation. Marx and Weber thought it happened between about 1450 and 1650. Edward Thompson and others think that the long archway from whatever was there before to capitalism occurred between 1200 and 1800. I personally believe there was no revolutionary change at all, but a slow evolution from well before 1200. And depending on which timing you take, so will your view of what caused this change. What is certain is that if we examine our own lives, they are full of all the different forms of exchange, of gifts, of barter, of limited purpose money, of full money. Also, even in our capitalist world, the market is kept in check. There are very large areas, if you examine your own life, where the market principles still shouldn't intrude, even if there are scandals that they often do. For instance, in love, you don't pay for love, or you shouldn't. It turns into something else. And in friendship. In art, you should have pure art as well as obviously the economics of art. In games, the difference between amateur and professional games. In areas of the country, the national trust, the free areas of parks and libraries and so on and so on. These are areas where money shouldn't intrude in the same way. So we live in mixed worlds, but with a number of forms which have been, so to speak, glued on top of each other. And we can find the same sort of situation actually even in much, much simpler economies than our own. In the famous description of the Argonauts of the Pacific by Malinowski, he describes three major forms of exchange that are occurring simultaneously and which are forms of these different kinds. There is roughly the kind of bargaining, haggling, barter kind of exchange which is called Gimwali, Gimwali, and that goes on roughly all the time and people are quite open to that. Then there is another kind which is called Urigubu, Urigubu, which is seasonal giving of yams by a man to his sister's husband. And this maintains alliances between groups and is a ritual kind of giving, rather like our Christmas present in many ways, or Christmas cards. And then there is what is famously known as the Kula ring, through which Trobrianders are linked to a number of other islands, including mainland Papua New Guinea, where individuals exchange shell necklaces, which are known as Sulava, Soulava, which are passed round in a clockwise way. These necklaces go round from island to island in huge ceremonial exchanges in a clockwise direction, and they're exchanged against armbands, which are called Mwali, M-W-A-L-I, which circulate in a counterclockwise. So you get these two sets of things being exchanged against each other and going round like that. Now, no one makes any profit from that, but it cements relationships and it just allows people to peacefully engage with each other rather than, when they encounter strangers, having to size them up for a fight. As has been pointed out, the Kula rules left individuals with plenty of room to maneuver, determining the size and timing of their gift in order to gain as much prestige as possible. And it continues today. Its origins probably owe much to its political functions, we're told, in the age when there were no effective states in the region. Without the umbrella of security created by ceremonial of Kula of this kind, the simultaneous but separate organization of much more utilitarian bartering would have been too risky to carry on. So there is this question of where our particular market-driven world came from. Marx, as I say, thought it came in the 16th century. As he puts it, the circulation of commodities is the starting point of capital. The modern history of capital dates from the creation of the 16th century of a world embracing commerce and a world embracing market. In it, Max Weber roughly thinks the same sort of timing. In England, the mere fact of the development of a market as such destroyed the manorial system from within. So one system dissolved into another. But Polanyi thought it was much later. What is certain is that it has changed not only the mechanism of economic integration, but our whole philosophy, our whole way of life. We think in terms of money. We think in terms of, as Weber puts it, rational accounting, the freedom of the market, a rational technology for pursuing wealth, a calculable law, free labour, we can buy and sell labour, and commercialization of economic life right through. So if there is anything that underpins modern societies, it isn't kinship, and it in many ways isn't religion or even politics, it's the market. And another aspect of that is money, which I'll deal with in my last talk.